I'm Gary Goldvogel. I'm president of the Northwest Business Club, and we're the major sponsor for this event tonight. We heard our speaker today at the Northwest Business Club noon meeting, and the presentation was outstanding. So you all are in for a treat tonight. The noon focus was more on business and economic issues, touching a little bit on guns. Tonight's lecture is much more centered on the issue of gun control violence. And our speaker is eloquent and outstanding. What I'd like to do, first thing, is to thank the sponsors of the event. The Northwest Business Club is the major sponsor. Doug and Robin Williams, Yeager Sporting Goods, Skagit Arms, Spartan Arms, and Peterson Brothers Manufacturing are all sponsors. And without further ado, Elliot Fong.
Good evening, thank you all for coming. I will be very brief, unlike my friend Gary. Dr. John Lott is an American economist and political commentator, formerly employed at various academic institutions, including the University of Chicago, Yale University, the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, the University of Maryland, College Park, and at the American Enterprise Institute conservative think tank. He's currently a Fox News opinion contributor, and he holds a PhD in economics from UCLA. There's more, but I won't continue on that vein. Dr. Lott has written for both academic and popular publications. He's a frequent writer of op-eds. Ann Coulter, who many of you may be familiar with, called him America's most feared economist. And I just learned this evening that when John was a sophomore, for his summer reading, he read 7 economic textbooks. I don't know many people that can hold a candle to him. We're very pleased to have him here, and I want you all to give a warm welcome to Dr. John Lott.
Well, thanks very much. Very nice of you to have me here. There's no clock in the room, so if I go too long, I hope you'll let me know. Well, this afternoon we mainly talked about the economy and the work that I've done on that. So now we're mainly going to be talking about gun issues and gun control issues. There's one question I want you to keep in the back of your mind, and that is, you don't need to answer now, but can you name one place, any place in the world, doesn't have to be in the United States, where guns have been banned and murder rates have gone down? Because at least for all the places that we have crime data, official crime data, both before and after a ban, I can't find it. Every place that I can look at, you see an increase in murder rates after guns are banned, and often very large increases in murder rates. Americans have had a lot of experience with gun-free zones. Obviously, it's been the forefront of the debate in places like Chicago and Washington, D.C., with Supreme Court decisions that came down that struck down those complete bans on guns. But it's much broader than that. It's with concealed carry, you have bans on where you can go and carry the guns sometimes, like schools or universities. In the cases of D.C. and Chicago, people are generally familiar with the big increases that we saw in murder rates and violent crimes after the bans were there. Usually the response that you'll get from gun control advocates is that, well, it wasn't a fair test. That unless you go and ban guns every place, then criminals will go and get guns from Maryland and Virginia in the case of DC, or they'll get them from the rest of Illinois in the case of Chicago. Problem is, I can understand why that might explain why murder rates might not have fallen as much as they were predicted, but it doesn't explain to me why there would be increases in murder rates. Presumably people were able to go and get those weapons from those neighboring places before the bans went into effect. And beyond that, it's just not the United States you can look at. You have whole countries around the world that have adopted gun bans. Murder rates have gone up in each of those places. You even have island nations which have adopted gun bans. They have no neighbor that they can obviously go and blame for supplying guns. And yet, even in what you think would be kind of the ideal test, an island nation with readily defendable borders, easily identified borders there, you still have the same increases in murder rates and violent crime after bans have been imposed. Now, there's other areas in life that we've seen gun bans. I'm just going to go through a couple, and the reason is it reminds me of the way these debates usually go. When I've gotten involved in gun control debates, one of the types of arguments you'll frequently run into are these hypothetical things about things that might possibly go wrong if you let people have guns. And the problem is people usually presume that whatever the rules that we have right now are, they seem to think that those have always been the case. And that's often not the case. I'll just give you a couple examples. After 9/11, I was asked by several of the airline pilots unions to be able to go and help them make it so that pilots would again be able to go and carry guns on planes. There was a lot of opposition to that. It was somewhat difficult to get it through. One senator talked to made the claim, he said, well, what happens if you have two pilots in front of the plane, they get into an argument, both pilots pull out their guns and they shoot each other. Then where are you going to be then? Or you have other cases where I think people have seen a few too many James Bond movies and they're worried about somebody accidentally firing a gun, putting a hole in the size of the fuselage, and everybody being sucked down through the hole. Just, I learned a lot about planes, helping out in this. One thing is, I realized with planes, I don't know, are there any pilots here? Usually a couple of pilots. Anyway, planes already have lots of little holes in them. And adding one or two more holes isn't really going to be noticeable. And in fact, any commercial airline you're in, there's a relatively big hole at the back of the plane. It's designed to help pull the air through the fuselage. And also in terms of the pilots being able to carry guns, one thing I learned pretty quickly was that between the early 1920s and 1963, every commercial airline pilot in the United States was mandated to carry a loaded handgun with them when they flew. There was no psychological screening test, there was no training test. It was just, when you became a commercial airline pilot, you were mandated to always have a loaded handgun with you when you flew. And the reason was, it got started because in the early 20s, when the Postal Service started putting mail on planes, there was a concern that if a plane crashed with mail on it, you wanted to make sure that the pilot was armed so he'd be able to go and protect the mail and keep it from being stolen. And if you were a commercial airline pilot, the argument was there was always some chance that you would be asked to go and carry mail. And so they just made it a blanket requirement for all commercial airline pilots to be armed. And so you've had tens of millions of flights over the years. Even after '63, pilots were allowed to carry loaded handguns with them up until the end of 1979 when Jimmy Carter banned the practice. But with all those decades, with all those tens of millions of flights, you can go back through the old Civil Aeronautics Board records and the FAA records, and what you find is that there's not a single recorded incident of something bad happening with the pilots carrying handguns. There's about several dozen cases actually where armed pilots made citizens arrest for criminals that were on planes, but never an example of something bad happening over that period of time. So, people can go and make these hypothetical guesses about what's going to happen, but usually you can find, if you look around, you can go and find evidence that can make it so you don't have to just guess, you can actually look at what the pattern is. I don't know if any of you have read either Colin Powell's autobiography or Antonin Scalia's autobiography. Both Scalia, who's Supreme Court Justice, both of them grew up in New York City. Both of them were on riflery teams at their local public high schools. And one thing, be surprised how little a lot of New Yorkers even know about what New York used to be like in the past. But up until 1969, all but one of the public high schools in New York City had a riflery team. And guns weren't stored in schools, people would keep them at their homes. And what you'd have happen is that on any given school day, you'd have someplace between 6,000 and 8,000 students who belong to these riflery teams, carrying their guns with them on city streets, on subways, on buses, and taxi cabs, on their way to school in the morning. They would leave them unlocked in the back of homerooms at school. And then they would go and pick up their guns and carry them with them to go to riflery ranges in the evening and then home again. If you're going to tell people in New York City today that you'd have someplace between 6,000 and 8,000 13 to 18-year-olds walking around the streets of New York City carrying their rifles with them, they would think you were crazy. And but yet that used to be a very common occurrence in New York City as late as 1969. Again, you can go back, look through the records, and there's no evidence that there was any problem that arose with that. Now, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on one type of data that's used in the gun debate, simply because it's used a lot. I don't really put much weight on it, but it's something that needs to be talked about. It's what we call cross-sectional data, and that is you look across different jurisdictions at one point in time. And I'm sure you've seen these types of arguments lots of times. People will go and say, Piers Morgan, for example, will go and say something like, well, look, the UK has relatively few guns, has relatively few gun murders or murders, and the United States has more guns and more murders, and therefore it's the fact that the United States has so many guns causes so many murders here. Sounds plausible. Problem is, what I would point out to Piers is I would say, well, before they had the gun control laws, like the 1997 ban on handguns, the UK had an even lower murder rate. And I'll show you graphs on that a little bit later. There's lots of reasons that murder rates vary across places. But the problem with purely cross-sectional data is that you simply can't control for a lot of things, and it really can provide a very misleading picture of how crime rates change and what affects them. I'll just give you an example or two. A few years ago, the New York Times did a series on the death penalty. And one of the things that they found was they said, look, the states with the death penalty have a higher murder rate than the states without the death penalty. So maybe the death penalty even causes murder rates to go higher, but they said that there's no evidence that it causes it to fall. Here's the problem. The states without the death penalty would be states like Alaska, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Vermont, Michigan, a few others at the time, but most of them were very small states that had low murder rates, that always had low murder rates. And the states that adopted were the ones that had high murder rates. And so the problem is, it's possible that adopting the death penalty could cause the murder rate to fall, but not so much as to be as low as the low murder rate states that may have never felt the need to go and adopt the death penalty to begin with. But if you're merely looking across places at one point in time, it would look like the states with the death penalty have a higher murder rate, even though it had caused it to fall. And so you get this impression that states with death penalty have higher murder rates. The only way you can really answer that question is not by looking across places, but by following each of those jurisdictions over time and seeing how their murder rates change before and after the implementation of the death penalty that's there, and how they changed over time relative to the jurisdictions that didn't change their laws. You see similar types of issues with gun control. Let's take an example of, say, cities. And let's say the cities with high crime rates were the ones that would adopt strictest gun control measures, which is, I think, true. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, though I don't think it is true, that gun control caused the murder rates to fall. Again, you have the same pattern. It caused it to fall. Maybe not as much as it got as low as the low crime rate cities that didn't adopt the gun control. If I only look across places, it would make it look like gun control caused crime rates to go up, even though it caused it to fall. And again, the only way you can look at this is by what we call panel data, or looking at these many different jurisdictions over time to sort it out. So, but we see a lot of discussions with cross-sectional data. Now, there's something, I don't know if you're not going to be able to read the axis here, but I'll basically tell you what it is. You'll see the general pattern. There's something called this small arms survey, which is basically done by this George Soros type group out of Switzerland. And they have this measure of number of guns per 100 people in the country. And that's what's on this bottom axis. This is supposedly the United States at 88 guns per 100 people. And then you have Switzerland, which is supposed to be 47 guns per 100 people. And then you have a country like Israel, which is supposed to be way down over here, which is about 7 guns per 100 people. If you look at all the countries in the world that they have the gun data for, and they kind of selectively picked a look at which countries that they would have. We'll get into that more in a minute. But you, in fact, even with their set of countries, if you look at all the countries, you in fact see that there's this negative relationship. More firearms per 100 people is associated with a lower homicide rate. So you have homicide rates here. Now, there's a couple problems with this. I'll just mention one. This small arms survey data, even though if you read the New York Times, God only knows in the last 6-7 months they must have mentioned this 20 times or 30 times in the newspaper, this survey. It's really pretty useless. I'll just give you a couple examples with Switzerland, for example. In 2007, which is what this survey purports to look at gun ownership numbers for, you had it so that all able-bodied males at the time, between the ages of 18 and 42, were mandated to have a military weapon, a machine gun in their home. And you could request that you be able to keep the gun after age 42. Most people would do so. But those weren't counted as guns possessed by individuals because the guns were technically owned by the government. You know, if you want to go and ask about the risks or benefits of having people have guns in their home, whether or not it was owned by the government or whether it was privately owned, it seems like you would want to count it in either case. In Israel, and in Switzerland, it's traditionally had one of the lowest murder rates in Europe. Israel, which has 7 guns per 100 people, almost no guns are privately owned in Switzerland. The government technically owns the guns. Now, you may have possession of the gun for 40 or 50 years, okay? But the small arms survey didn't count that as a gun that people possess because the government, even though you had, you know, for all technical senses, ownership of the gun, you just didn't legally own it. The government owns it, but you had possession of it. Again, it seems like if the concern is whether people have guns and people have them in their homes, you would want to count them. You wouldn't want to assume Israel has such a low gun ownership rate. And again, Israel has one of the lowest murder rates in the world. Now, that becomes a little bit more problematic. Well, I'll just show you one other thing. Now again, this isn't all countries, this is just the ones that they used. If you put in all countries using WHO data, and I should take the time to do that one of these days, you're going to get a lot more countries up in this area. But this red line here is for the United States, and it kind of gives you an idea if you look at all the countries that at least the Small Arms Survey put together gun ownership data, where we stand among these countries. The top 10 countries in the world have gun bans, by the way, in terms of that have murder rates. But now, if you just look at developed countries, which would include Switzerland and Israel, for example, but I'm excluding the U.S. for right now, so I'm just asking the question, what can the U.S. learn from other countries? You, in fact, find a negative relationship between gun ownership and homicides. Now again, I think Switzerland and Israel, which have low murder rates, you can see Israel right here and Switzerland, they should really be way out here someplace, and that would help pull down this line even more. The U.S. has a murder rate of about 4.5 right now per 100,000 people, and so that's about the same as Turkey here. And that is so far out here because of the way they've constructed that one observation by itself tends to pull up the line here. But but that would be more than offset if you had it so that Switzerland and Israel had numbers that were comparable to what the gun ownership rates are in those countries. I can just show you that. So again, I'm just showing you this cross-sectional data. I don't, even if it shows a negative relationship, I really don't care. I'm just showing you here just because people make so much of a discussion about cross-sectional data. I think it's too problematic. There are lots of reasons why crime rates vary across countries, and it's very hard to control for that if you just look at this cross-sectional data. Now, I want to talk about two kind of experiments we've had here in the United States with regard to gun bans, DC and Chicago. If you go back when the Supreme Court struck down DC's handgun ban and gun lock laws, there were a lot of predictions about what was going to happen. I can show you 30 pages of quotes here at least. I'm just going to show you one, and that is the day the Supreme Court decision came down, Washington, D.C.'s mayor at the time, Adrian Fenty, said more handguns in the District of Columbia will only lead to more gun violence. There's a similarity, but there's also an important difference between the Chicago and D.C. gun bans, or Supreme Court decisions. And that is, we think about it in terms of the gun ban being struck down. But in D.C., there was one other thing, and that was people could legally own long guns, but up until the Supreme Court decision, it was a felony for you to actually chamber a bullet in a long gun or put a shotgun shell in a shotgun, punishable by 5 years in prison. And people were put in jail, so essentially it made it a crime for you to use the long guns in self-defense. And what the Supreme Court did was they said, look, we can go and say you have a right to own a gun for self-defense, but if we don't do anything about these gun laws, then it'll be a felony for you to actually use the guns in self-defense, and that kind of defeats the whole purpose of our striking down the gun ban. So they also struck down the gun laws. And the reason why that was important is because they still make it fairly difficult for you to get a handgun. In Washington, D.C., there's about, according to the Washington Post, it costs about $534 to go through the licensing and registration process for a handgun. Basically, the only people who can do that are basically relatively well-to-do white people. And what you find is that there's almost no poor blacks, obviously, who go and obtain a gun, essentially zero. So you only have a few thousand people in either Washington, D.C. or Chicago that have gone through the process to get a handgun permit and get it licensed. But there was something else, and that is you had about 72,000 adults in Washington, D.C. who were licensed and registered to own long guns. And so that's about a quarter of the adult population in D.C., which overnight were able to legally now use those guns for self-defense. That's a pretty large change to say a quarter of the adult population now is legally able to go and use guns for self-defense than you had before. You didn't have much of a change in their ability to use handguns. You had a fairly large change in their ability to go and use long guns. There's no such similar change in Chicago. Now, there's lots of ways you can go and measure changes in crime rates over time. The simplest is simply to go and say, well, how does the crime rate in Chicago or Washington, D.C. after the Supreme Court struck down the ban or after the ban was put in place compared to what it was before? If you look at the ban being imposed, there's only 1 year after D.C.'s gun ban was imposed that its murder rate was as low as it was prior to the ban going into effect. And in Chicago, there's no year after the ban was put into effect where its murder rate was as low as it was prior to the ban going into effect. But, you know, that's a little bit not too useful just looking at it. Lots of things change. One thing you can do is you compare it simply to other cities in the country. Again, there are multiple ways you can look at this, but one simple way of looking at it is just to say, how did DC or Chicago rank relative to other cities before and after the ban was in place. In DC's case, immediately before the ban, DC's murder rate ranked about 20th in terms of the top 50 cities. After the ban, half the years it was either number 1 or number 2. 2/3 of the time it was in the top 4. There's no year prior to the ban going into effect where DC was higher than 15. It was nowhere near being in the top 2 or being in the top 4. Now there's a third way you could look at this, and this shows the least change, but I wanted to show it to you. And that is just showing DC's murder rate as a percentage of the murder rate in the other 50 largest cities. DC's murder rate was falling prior to the ban going into effect. It was about 40% higher down to about 10% higher. After the ban was put in place, basically in February '97, it shot back up to about 40, 60%. You get about 13 years out, it's about 80% higher than it was prior to the ban going into effect. Now, the reason why I show you just the first 13 years after, even though it's a fairly sizable increase, and that is, after you get past those 13 years, there's a huge increase in DC's murder rate relative to the murder rate in other cities. For 4 of these years, it corresponds to the crack cocaine epidemic. But that was basically a national epidemic. The question is why it affected DC more than other cities. I would argue in part it was due to the fact that people were less able to go and protect themselves. But even after the epidemic subsided, after these 4 dots that you see here, it still remained dramatically higher than these other cities, than the murder rates in these other cities. Now, just show you something briefly here about what's happened to DC's murder and violent crime rates after the Supreme Court struck down the ban. The Supreme Court struck down the ban at the very end of June 2008. By the end of July 2008, the District of Columbia had passed new gun control regulations in response to the Supreme Court decision. So after that point, it was legal to go and register and apply for handguns, and the gun lock laws had been removed. Now, I can show you the data for the whole year. There's a problem if we're looking at the whole year, and that is the ban was only in effect for the first 7 months of 2008. So if you only want to look at the last 7 months of the ban's in effect, and we want to compare the same 7 months across all the years, we look at 07, 08, 09, 2010, 2011, 2012, you can see what, and the reason why we want to look at the same period of time in each year is murder rates and violent crime rates vary a lot over the course of the year. They're much higher in the summer than they are in the winter, for example. And you can see here, during the first 7 months of 07, it was 104 homicides. During 08, it was 107. Fell to 82 in 09, 70 in 2010, 62 in 2011, and 51 in 2012. If I looked at the whole years, I'd get about a 50% drop. Here we get a 52% drop. If you look at violent crime rates, all the violent crime rates fall. There's a couple interesting patterns here. I'm just going to point out one, and that is the drop in gun crimes is greater than the drop in non-gun crimes. So you can look at robberies here. These are robberies without guns, and that is essentially zero change. It's 1/10 of 1%. It's no change at all. Here's robberies with guns. It falls from about 797 during the last 7 months there to 707 during the first 12 months of 2012. That's an 11% drop. And if you look at aggravated assaults without guns fell by only 4%. Aggravated assaults with guns, though, fell from 424 to 293. That's about a 31% drop. And this is consistent with other things. Basically, what we found, you look at concealed carry research, is that when you allow law-abiding citizens to have guns, criminals actually are less likely to carry guns with them at that point. Gun crimes go down more than non-gun crimes do. So obviously there are lots of factors that change. Just comparing it to other cities is very simple type of comparison there. But the regressions, I show these in the 3rd edition of More Guns, Less Crime, but you can account for arrest rates, conviction rates, prison sentence lengths, the death penalty, number of police per capita, expenditures on police per capita, different types of policing policies. You can include population density, other types of gun control laws, demographics, income, poverty, and so on. And even after you account for all these things, you in fact see an even greater increase in murder rates in DC and Chicago than if you hadn't tried to account for those things. If you look at Chicago, I can show it to you many different ways. I'll just show you here for the largest 10 cities. Chicago's murder rate was falling relative to those other 10 cities right up until the time the ban went into effect at the end of November 1982. It stopped falling and generally started to rise after that. There's no year after the ban was in effect where Chicago's murder rate relative to that of other large cities was as low as it was in 1982. If you compare Chicago's murder rate to the 6 counties that are adjacent to it, Chicago's murder rate relative to those relatively non-urban counties was falling prior to the ban. It stopped falling. Not all the counties in Illinois report murder rates in 1984, so that's left blank. But you can see a very large increase in murder rates in Chicago relative to the surrounding counties after the ban was put in place. Now, there are lots of countries I can show you data for. I'm just going to show you data here for some island nations that ban guns. So you'd think this would be the ideal situation. We ban guns on an island nation, easily defendable, readily identifiable borders that are there, no neighbor to go and blame for guns, and yet we'll see some very large increases in murder rates here. So this is for Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. Their gun ban went into effect in 1972, the beginning of 1972. You can see Ireland's murder rates during the 40s and 60s and very early 70s here bouncing around in a relatively narrow range. Immediately after the ban went into effect, its murder rate soared, remained dramatically higher for the entire period of time. Now, here we have a lot of drug gang problems, but even if you abstract that away, it's much higher for the rest of the period. We can talk more about it later. But the thing is, obviously the gun ban didn't stop the drug gangs from getting a hold of guns. If you look at Jamaica, Jamaica's gun ban went into effect in January 1975. During the 60s and early 70s, Jamaica's murder rate was very similar to the murder rate in the United States. Immediately after the gun ban went into effect, the murder rate soared. Now there's some political violence here, and there's some political and drug gang violence over here. But again, even if you remove those periods of time, it's much higher. And the thing is, it's just not these other countries that have a drug gang problem. The United States, compared to a lot of developed countries, has a very bad drug gang problem. And the problem is, we know how hard we've tried to stop illegal drugs from coming into the United States. But it's hard to stop the drug gangs from bringing in the guns that they use to protect the property. It's not like if one drug gang goes and steals another gang's drugs, they go and call the police and say, look, can you help us get our drugs back? What they have to do is they have to go and set up their own militaries, essentially, in order to go and protect their very valuable property. If tomorrow we could magically click our fingers and cause all illegal drugs to disappear and all guns in the United States to disappear, my guess is almost immediately illegal drugs would start coming back into the country. And my guess is also that the drug gangs would find a way of bringing in guns just as quickly. because they'd want to have something in order to go and protect this very valuable property that they have, these illegal drugs. Now, I don't think most people realize how much violent crime in the United States is drug gang related. The Obama administration came out with a report in 2009. I have some significant problems with their report, but there's at least in a broad sense it's right. They were arguing that about 80% of violent crimes in the United States were gang related, and that the vast majority of that was drug gang related. You can see this in a couple different ways. Probably the simplest is 3% of the counties in the United States account for 23% of the population, but they account for about 75% of the murders in the country. And if you live in a major urban area and the newspaper goes and publishes a map of how murders are distributed, one thing you'll notice, if you lived in LA or Chicago or DC or New York or whatever, the murders aren't evenly spread out throughout the city. They're usually very heavily concentrated in just a few tiny pockets within those counties. And it's basically drug gang related murders that you have. And anyway, the point is that we have a drug gang problem. We have a lot of crime. So does anybody know what year had the highest murder rate in the United States history? Anybody would guess? 1932, right. Basically, it was the last year of Prohibition. Within 2 years after Prohibition had ended, the murder rate in the United States had fallen by about 60%. You had mob fighting against each other, the mafia, to try to go control the distribution of alcohol in different places. And it was very valuable to control them. And so you'd have them fighting against each other in order to be the ones that were dominant in particular areas. And you have a similar type of phenomenon that occurs with regard to drug gangs. Now here's a graph of the UK's murder rate. This line here, obviously it's kind of faded here, but this line is for 1997, January 97, when the handgun ban went into effect. You can see that how the murder rate in the UK soared in the next 8 years after that. Basically goes up about 50%. And then there's a sudden drop in it, but it's still slightly higher than it was before the ban went into effect. So what happened? Is there like a 9-year lag after you ban guns? It goes up and then it falls. It still remains higher though? No, I think there's actually a pretty simple explanation for what's going on. This drop is about 2004. And if you look over here, this graph shows you the number of police officers in England. And starting in about 2003, 2004, there's a huge increase in the number of police officers. You basically have about an 18% increase in the number of police officers in 3 years. And it's not too surprising to me, as you go in 3 years, you have an 18% increase in the number of police officers, because people were pretty upset by the increased murders and violent crimes that were occurring, that you're going to see a drop in murder rates occurring. So I would basically argue this drop that occurred, it's still higher. Even after this huge increase in number of police officers, it's still a higher murder rate than it was before, but the drop coincides extremely well with this huge increase in the number of police officers, and it's well after the ban went into effect. I just thought I'd spend a minute here. This isn't quite the same problem, but a lot of people go and point to Australia a lot. Australia had a large gun buyback in 1996 and 97. The number of legally owned, licensed, registered guns in Australia was about 3.2 million. With buyback, reduced it to about 2.2 million. So it's about a third drop. It's a pretty large drop that occurred there. What's usually not mentioned is that in the next 13 years or so, people went back out and bought a lot of guns. And in fact, the gun ownership rate now is virtually identical to what it was before the buyback occurred. And so, if the common claim that's made that the buyback reduced murders, reduced suicides and crime, then what you should see is a sudden drop in those crimes. And then as the gun ownership rate increased, you should see it increasing again after that. Well, here's homicides in Australia. This is 96 where the buyback occurred. Basically for the next 8 years, it's pretty much flat. After about 8 years, it starts to fall, but you don't see this drop and then this increase. This slight drop is occurring when the increase in gun ownership is occurring there. And you look at armed robberies, this is kind of the exact opposite of what you would expect. Armed robberies, when the buyback occurred, you saw this big increase in armed robberies. And it's only later on that's a drop, though it's still higher than it was before the buyback occurred. Now you can look at suicides, and you can break it down by suicides with firearms, which is this dotted line, and then you have suicides, non-firearm suicides, which is a solid line here. People have made a lot of the fact that firearm suicides fell after the gun buyback, and that's true. They did fall. But they're basically falling for a decade before this. And so I can't really see much of a difference in the rate of drop here. The interesting thing is, so it's not clear why one would want to ascribe this drop here to it, given that it was already falling. But the other interesting thing is that the drop in firearm suicides is virtually identical to the size of the drop in non-firearm suicides. So, and the third problem is, if it had an effect on suicides, you would imagine that there would be a sudden drop and then an increase as the rate of gun ownership went back to what it was before, rather than this continual drop over time. So it seems, you look at this, it's pretty hard to see, or figure out why anybody would make any deal about Australia as being pointed to as an example that we should follow. I can show you the same thing for homicides. Basically, firearm homicides were pretty flat. They started falling about a decade before the buyback. The drop in non-firearm suicides is also fairly similar. Now, I just mentioned this, I don't remember, in the hallway earlier we talked about Massachusetts. They had a licensing law that went into effect in 1997. There were about 1.5 million people that owned legally licensed guns at that time. The licensing rules basically were used to dramatically reduce the number of legally owned guns in Massachusetts. You end up going from about 1.5 million people legally owning guns to a little bit over 200,000 people just in a 13-year period of time. That's a huge drop in legally owned guns in 13 years. And it's pretty clear that the licensing rules were used specifically to try to reduce gun ownership. So one thing you can do is you can compare Massachusetts' murder rate to the murder rate in the rest of the United States or to its neighbors. This graph here shows that when the licensing rules went into effect, how did Massachusetts' murder rate change relative to other states? And you can see it's kind of bouncing around here, falls before the licensing goes into effect, and then it's pretty much as gun ownership rates are falling in Massachusetts, legally owned guns, Massachusetts' murder rate relative to the United States is soaring. You can also look at it relative to its neighbors. Massachusetts' murder rate was fairly constant relative to its neighbors prior to the licensing rules going into effect. And then after the licensing rules went into effect, as you're having this reduction in gun ownership there, you're seeing this big increase in Massachusetts' murder rates relative to its neighboring states. And this is the one for robbery. Prior to the licensing rules, Massachusetts' robbery rate was actually falling dramatically relative to its other neighbors. And then as soon as the licensing rule goes into effect and you start to reduce gun ownership, it stops falling, it starts to increase. I don't know how much more dramatic you could have as far as graphs go. Now, so here's an interesting question. That is, we look at these things, you ban guns, murder rates go up. You know, you'd think at least there'd be a couple times where you'd find murder rates going down. But yet you seem to find time after time when guns are banned, murder rates go up. And so why is that? Well, I think there's a fairly simple explanation for that, and that is when you go and you ban guns, the question is who obeys the law? And basically it turns out it's the law-abiding good citizens, not the criminals who obey the law. And the problem is if you disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, I'm not saying it doesn't have any impact on criminals, but it primarily is obeyed by law-abiding citizens. And the problem is that when you disarm law-abiding citizens relative to criminals, you actually make it easier for them to go and commit crimes rather than more difficult. And you see an increase in crimes as a result of that. You know, and it's an issue that's relevant not just for bans, but for other types of gun control laws. When you pass a law, you know, whether it was at lunch today we talked about background checks and stuff, you know, you have to ask who's primarily affected by it. And if it's primarily law-abiding citizens, you can get this type of relationship here. Now, so we have, as I mentioned, gun-free zones not just in terms of cities or countries, but you have it in terms of other areas like college campuses or what have you. And you have to ask yourself, who obeys these bans when we put them into effect? So you have something like Virginia Tech. We had a horrible mass shooting there, which 32 people were killed back in 2007. Virginia is like Washington State in the sense that you have relatively few gun-free zones around here. And if you have a concealed handgun permit, you can carry it virtually any place in the state. But the problem is that there are a few places, like universities, court buildings, airports, where you're not allowed to take your permanent concealed handgun. So let's say you're a university professor, and you go and can carry your gun virtually any place in the state. But if you accidentally carry your permanent concealed handgun on school property, and you get caught, you're going to get fired from the university. What do you think the likelihood of finding another academic job someplace in the United States is if you get fired for a firearms-related violation at a university? You're trying to get another job at another university. Your odds are basically zero that you're going to get another job. How about if you're a student? Again, you can carry the gun virtually any place in the state. Let's say you accidentally carry it on a school property and you get caught. You're going to get expelled. What's the likelihood of you getting into another university with having been expelled from another university because of firearms-related violation? It's not quite zero, but it's going to be pretty close. And so, but let's say you're the killer, somebody who had gone and killed 32 people. Even assuming you had lived, the killer died there. About 75% of the time people go and commit these crimes, they die at the scene. But let's say this killer lived. What sense does it make likely that the threat of expulsion would be the key penalty that would keep him from committing this crime? I mean, it just seems absurd to me that anybody think that that would be the key penalty. Here's a guy who's going to be facing 32 life sentences or 32 death penalties, and the notion that the one penalty wouldn't be the 32 death penalties that would keep him from committing the crime, but the fact, and other collateral penalties that he may face, but the fact that he could be expelled, as if he might be able to go to school, even despite the death penalties, or in any case. It's not really clear why people would think that would matter. So here's the problem that you face, and that is, again, we face a situation where we go and we ban guns from being in certain areas. Who's most likely to obey it? It's basically the law-abiding good citizens who face real penalties. If you're an academic, and you're no longer allowed to be an academic, or let's say you're an undergraduate or a graduate student, you're a law student, and you get expelled, you basically have to accept the fact you're never going to become a lawyer, or you're going to have to accept the fact you're never going to get an MBA or a PhD or finish your undergraduate that's there. Those are real life-altering penalties that you're going to face. But it's not a real penalty for this guy who's going to be facing 32 life sentences or 32 death penalties. And so the problem that you face is these penalties basically make it so that the only people who obey the law, they probably would have obeyed it anyway, even without the penalty, are the most law-abiding good citizens who you wouldn't have to worry about to begin with. Now, let me just ask you to think about something for a second. Let's say, God forbid, you were being threatened by a stalker. Would you feel safer putting a sign in front of your home that said, "This home is a gun-free zone"? Would that make you feel that it'd be less likely the person would be to attack you there? Let's say you're a burglar and you come up to a neighborhood and you see two houses next to each other. One has a sign that said, "This home is a gun-free zone," and the other one doesn't have a sign. Which one are you going to break into? And I think most people don't even have to think about this. I mean, I've debated lots of people on these issues. I've never run into somebody who would admit publicly, even for the sake of just admitting in front of an audience that they're arguing in front of, that they would put up a sign like that in front of their home saying their home is a gun-free zone. The answer is obvious. That it doesn't work as a deterrent. If anything, it actually does the opposite. It actually serves as a magnet. It makes it more likely that people are going to go and commit crimes in those areas. And that's the same problem with these gun-free zones that we go and we set up. So, I suppose one way just to drive this home further is if you look at all the multiple victim public shootings in the United States since at least 1950, with just two exceptions, every one of the multiple victim public shootings have taken place where guns are banned. All the multiple victim public shootings in Europe, even in Switzerland, have taken place where guns are banned in the tiny areas there in the country. You take something like the Colorado movie theater shooting last July. You have a situation there where there were 7 movie theaters showing the Batman premiere within a 20-minute drive of the killer's apartment. Only one of those movie theaters posted a sign in Colorado, like in some other states. Private property owners are allowed to post signs banning permanent concealed handguns. Only one of the movie theaters had posted signs banning a permanent concealed handgun. The killer didn't go to the movie theater that was closest to his home. Didn't go to the movie theater that was second closest to his home. He didn't go to the movie theater that had the largest auditoriums in the state of Colorado. One of the movie theaters, if you call up their hotline, the very first thing they say is home of the largest auditoriums in the state of Colorado. You would think if somebody wanted to go and kill a lot of people on a premiere night, where the movie theater was going to be packed, he'd want to go to a place where there'd be a lot of victims that would be there. And so why not go to the place that had the largest auditoriums? He didn't go there. Instead, and that was about 4.8 miles from his house, his apartment. Instead, he went to the one movie theater that was about 4.5 miles from his apartment that had posted signs banning permanent concealed handguns. We now know that you also staked out the places beforehand to kind of, we don't know exactly what he was looking for, but it surely seems as if this was something that he may have been taking into account. You look at the mall shootings in Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, or Kansas City, Kansas, or in Salt Lake City. What do you find? You may have had 8 malls in Omaha that were enclosed malls. Only one posted signs banning permanent concealed handguns. Which one did the guy go to? In Kansas City, you had 7 malls. 2 of them posted. You went to one that didn't. In Salt Lake City, you had 7 malls there, only one posted. Where did he go in that case? And at some point, it's just not random that these things are happening. Even if it was 10%, it would still be too low. I mean, Washington, you carry a gun virtually every place here. If it was random, then 98, 99% of the multiple victim public shootings should be taking place in areas where guns are allowed, as opposed to them all occurring in just this tiny fraction of places where they're not. In Switzerland, you have very liberal concealed carry laws. Half the cantons in the country, you don't need a permit. And the other half, it's like Washington State, where you have a right to carry law, you apply for it, it's granted. They had no multiple victim public shootings in Switzerland until 2001. They had no gun-free zones in Switzerland until 2000. Basically, the only places you have gun-free zones in Switzerland are in a few government buildings. And they've had 3 major multiple victim public shootings over the last decade or so. And all of them have occurred in these tiny areas within the country where you have guns are banned. Bill Landis at the University of Chicago and I looked at all the multiple victim public shootings from 1977 through 1999. We looked at 13 different types of gun control laws. We looked at law enforcement, all the things we looked at with the concealed carry rules. And we found a couple interesting things. One is police. I believe, if anybody's read my books, I believe police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. And they're very important for reducing violent crimes generally, but they didn't have a statistically significant impact on these multiple victim public shootings. And the question is why? And I think the explanation is pretty simple, and that is, how does law enforcement work? Law enforcement works by catching people and punishing them after the fact. But you look at these individuals, they're basically trying to commit suicide. 75%, as I mentioned before, die at the scene. Even in the 25% who live, if you look at interviews with them, they planned on dying at the scene, but they just couldn't bring themselves at the last moment to go and pull the trigger to commit suicide. So if you're committing a crime where you're just trying to kill yourself, and you don't believe you're going to be alive after you do this, what difference does it make to you what law enforcement's going to do to you after the crime? Because you're not planning on being around to do it. So it's not too surprising that law enforcement doesn't affect the rate at which these attacks occur or how bad they are. You know, the general thing is that determines how many people get killed or injured in these attacks is the amount of time that elapses between when the attack starts and when somebody's able to arrive on the scene with the gun. The longer the amount of time, the more carnage you're going to have. You know, take something like the Newtown case. The time between when the first 911 call went out and the first responders arrived outside the school building was 20 minutes. It took 90 minutes before the first responders went into the school. But even 20 minutes there is a huge amount of time. And, you know, even if it was 10 minutes, it would be a huge amount of time. And so one of the benefits of concealed carry, is that a signal for time?
You're worn out.
Okay, yeah, there's no clock here. I warned you about that. So, so I apologize, but I'm getting near the end. Anyway, so there was,
10 minutes. 20 minutes.
Right. So, anyway, the amount of time between when the attack occurs and when somebody's able to arrive on the scene with the gun determines how many people get killed or injured in these attacks. When I'm thinking about the Newtown case, and this, I think this is pretty representative, it's scary when you read these guys' documents, how consciously they think about media coverage. They want to go and kill themselves, but they want to kill themselves in a way that will get media attention. The Newtown killer, I don't know if you've heard this, but he put together an Excel spreadsheet that was 4 by 7 feet, where he basically listed past mass shootings and the amount of media coverage that they received. And he essentially graphed it out. I don't know why he had to graph it out, but he graphed it out that basically showing that more people killed meant more media coverage. And his goal was apparently to exceed the Norway killer, who holds the record for multiple victim public shootings, where he killed 69 people with a gun, ignoring the people who died from the bomb blast, and he wounded another 110 people with the guns that he had. And you know, you just read these things. The Virginia Tech killer, the video that he left, they explicitly say, I want to kill more people than this past shooting, because if I do, I can get even more media attention. And so the thing is, how do you reduce the amount of media attention, or this goal that they have in their mind? There are two ways you can do it. One is, I guess you could get rid of the First Amendment and ban the media from going and mentioning these people's names or covering these attacks. That's not going to happen. I'm not advocating that. But the other thing you can do is you can try to reduce the amount of carnage. And just as these guys try to find areas where victims can't defend themselves, the reason why I think they do that, the reason why the Newtown killer went after a school where there'd be lots of tiny victims that he wasn't going to be able to be stopped by, maybe also the horror of having young children being killed, was that it would increase the body count and that he could then go and get more media attention as a result of that. So the question is, how quickly can you go and get somebody there with a gun in order to try to reduce the gain in these warped people's minds to doing it? If you look at, there's another interesting thing here. If you look at the impact that concealed carry laws have on murder rates or violent crimes, you find for murder rates, each additional year the right to carry laws. In fact, you'll see about a 1.5% drop in murder rates. For multiple victim public shootings, the effect is huge. When these laws pass, there's about a 60% drop in the rate of multiple victim public shootings, a 78% drop in the rate at which people are killed or injured from these attacks. And to the extent to which these attacks still occur, they overwhelmingly take place in the tiny areas, as I mentioned before, in the state where the concealed handguns aren't allowed. Now, why is there such a big difference? And again, I think there's a pretty simple explanation, and that is, if you have 5% of the adult population with concealed handgun permits, and a criminal attacks somebody late at night in a parking lot or a dark alley, there's some risk to the criminal, 5%, and there's some deterrence. So you see some reduction in crime. But let's say we have, 60 people here, let's say, or 70. Even if there's a 5% chance that any one individual is going to have a concealed handgun permit, and this assumes the probabilities are independent. Obviously, in an audience like this, that wouldn't be independent. But assuming that the probabilities were independent, the probability that at least someone would have a permit concealed handgun would essentially be 100%. And what you find is that as the probability that somebody's able to go and defend themselves increases, you see greater deterrence there. So it's not surprising that you have greater reductions where we have, essentially 100% probability that somebody's who's unknown to an attacker that may come running in the door here is going to be able to go and defend themselves. He doesn't know who he's going to take out first. I'll just maybe do one other thing really quickly, and that is maybe two other things. I'll just mention Israel is very interesting. Obviously, they've had to deal with terrorism problems over the years, and a couple interesting changes. If you look at how the terrorist attacks have occurred, in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the early 70s, almost all the terrorist attacks in Israel involved machine guns. From the early 70s on, almost all the terrorist attacks in Israel involved bombs. What changed? There's no change in technology for bombs. Maybe in the 80s, there were some changes in technologies for making bombs. The big change, I would argue, is that they started allowing people to go and carry concealed handguns in Israel. If you're a terrorist and you pull out your machine gun and start firing, you give people around you an opportunity to go and respond back if they have concealed handgun. If you're a terrorist who kills himself in blowing up a bomb, there's no chance of response. One article I quote from in More Guns, Less Crime is from a terrorist attack outside of Tel Aviv shortly after they changed these rules. It was on a school afternoon, and there were 4 terrorists that went into a suburban mall outside Tel Aviv. They pulled out the machine guns, started firing. The people in the mall pulled out their handguns, fired back. 3 of the terrorists were killed. 1 was seriously wounded. And the reason why I included it in the book was the terrorist who survived, when he was being taken to the hospital, was really upset, was complaining the whole way to the attendant in the ambulance, saying that nobody had warned him that these older ladies had these handguns. And so, I don't know, view it as a front. But here's the deal. Israel, for decades, what they would try to do if there was more terrorist attacks is hire more police or put more military on the street. The problem is terrorists have huge strategic advantages. The most obvious strategic advantage is that, let's say you have a terrorist on a bus and you have 2 police officers there. What are the options that he faces? Well, one option is he can simply be patient. He can wait until the police leave and then engage in his attack. Or what he can do is he can kill the police officers first and then go and kill the other people on the bus. Concealed handguns changed that, because now they don't know who they're supposed to go and take out first. Is it the guy behind them, or the side, or in front? And so, since they don't know who to go and take out first, it limits their ability to go and engage in the attack. What Israel found, though, was that no matter how many police they put on the street, no matter how many military they paid for, they didn't have an infinite amount of money. And if the terrorists were simply willing to be patient long enough, there'd be some opening that would open up for them to go and engage in the attack that was there. And there's lots of other things I could show you. I won't go through them too much. I'll just show you there's a large survey by Police One, which has about 410,000 active or retired police members to it. And they asked a lot of interesting questions just in March this year. One of them was, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high, how important do you think legally armed citizens are to reducing crime rates overall? So all these essentially are saying it's of some benefit. Here it's very little. Here it's extremely beneficial. You have about 55% say it's very beneficial. 22% say that it's very beneficial. And so you end up with about 76%, 77% of police officers saying that it's either very or extremely beneficial to have law-abiding citizens have guns for reducing crime. And then a lot of interesting things with regard to that survey. So just in summary, my research finds that police are the single most important factor, but that the police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's been committed. And that raises a question of what you advise people to do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves. And there's 2 groups of people who benefit the most from owning guns. They're basically people who are relatively weaker physically. Women and the elderly benefit much more than men do generally from owning guns. And people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime. And that overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. The people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime are the ones who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. So I would argue it's basically the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. Well, I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to take any questions that you guys have.
I hesitate to waste my question asking you this question, but I have a friend who I respect a lot. He's a very liberal guy, Korean War vet, and he used the example of the Aurora theater shooting. And he said if you would have had, if that wasn't a gun-free zone and people had concealed carry permits and were carrying weapons, and they just start shooting at this guy and took him down, that other bullets would have gone in other directions and would have hit innocent people.
Right. Well, you know, again, this kind of gets back to the hypothetical things that we always see. And I suppose the most direct way of dealing with that is to see what's actually happened in practice. Because we've had a lot of multiple victim public shootings in public schools and universities and churches and malls and other places that have been stopped by people with concealed handguns. You just had one recently in Portland, a mall there that was stopped. And the interesting thing is that I can't find a single case where mass shootings have been stopped by a citizen with a permanent concealed handgun where a bystander was accidentally shot. You know, another concern, so I'm not saying it's not possible that that type of thing can happen, but I'm just saying, if it was likely, you would at least find a few cases, or a couple cases, where that had been the case. The other similar related concern that's often brought up is that, well, you know, what happens if the police on the scene go and accidentally shoot the guy who has a concealed handgun permit? And, you know, again, it's possible, but again, there hasn't been a case where a police officer has shot somebody like that. So, you know, sure, police even once in a while accidentally shoot each other and things like that happen. I suppose the question is, let's just say that this data wasn't there. We couldn't go and look at these past cases that were there. The question would still be, okay, you may accidentally shoot somebody, but if nobody's there to go and stop the guy, how many people might you shoot not accidentally? And so, you know, it seems on both of those reasons, it's not really clear why the better option is just to leave a free fire zone for the bad guy.
Yeah. The question I have relates to the question out of my head here. Come back to you just a moment.
Do you think we'll ever get national right to carry reciprocity passed in this nation?
Well, I don't think as long as Obama's president. Well, let's put it this way. There's a chance if it's amended to some other type of bill that he badly wants, that you could get it. But I think it's sufficiently high profile enough that it'd have to be a bill that he really wanted really bad. And I just don't think that's going to happen. So, you know, you have, I mean, you almost got 60 votes a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
right, and then you had Pryor and one other guy who had said that they were going to vote for it, Warner from Virginia, who said originally that they were going to vote for it, and then they flipped at the last moment to keep it from getting the 60 votes that were necessary. And so, you know, it's close there, and maybe with another president, it would be, you could get it through. Yes?
Is there an attempt to control the amount of ammunition allowed to be sold?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's something that's been talked about a lot. New York State just adopted some new gun laws or rules in early this year. And one of the things that they have is they require that you have to go through a background check to purchase ammunition. The thing is, in New York State, background checks through a dealer basically run about $85. And so that means every time you want to go and buy ammunition in New York State, you're having to pay an $85 fee in order to buy, you know, that's over and above the cost of the ammunition that's there. And so, you know, it's just an attempt to make the cost of people own. My argument would basically be, who are you going to affect the most? It's basically poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas, the people who benefit the most from owning guns. They're the ones who are going to be priced out of being able to have a gun. Really.
What can we do as citizens to try to stop this rising tide of anti-gun legislation that has tried to come down the pipe?
Well, I mean, I think you can go and write letters to newspapers. You can go and if you see mistakes in news articles, because I mean, it's amazing how many mistakes there are, you know, call up the reporters and talk to them about it. And you can call up the state legislators or federal ones, you know, when you see these things. I mean, you can write op-eds. I mean, this is basically a lot of the stuff I do. You know, I go and I write op-eds, I go and talk to people about these things, and, you know, you guys can do a similar thing. Yes.
Have you ever done a survey or an inquiry into seeing how many people would have been injured related to how many hunters that they were in the past and how many hunters there are today. Meaning that there used to be a lot more people hunting
Right.
than there is now.
Right.
It's very evident just in the population of deer throughout the whole United States. And that's a true fact. So the point is, there's less hunters.
Right.
So has there been any correlation between our rate of
Well, there are more hunters, but as a share of the population
and
is
share of
going
the
up.
population is less?
Right. And it's pretty much a very slight change, the number of hunters. But, I mean, even though you've had no decline in the number of hunters over time, we've seen drops in actual gun deaths occurring. That's part of what you're asking. But, I think obviously there are benefits from having hunters in terms of controlling deer population and other things like that. But, accidental deaths are something that I've studied some. I don't think, probably the largest single category of accidental deaths are involving hunting. And, but you're still talking about a relatively small portion there. And, so now we're down to about 600 accidental deaths a year. I don't think the number of hunters is going to explain that drop. Yeah. Let's put it this way. You look at almost any category of accidents, accidental deaths fall over time. It's like a rule. It's like any type of accidental death, pools, poisonings, car accidents, what have you, everything falls over time. And it's interesting because people will go and pass these auto safety regulations and things like that, and the government will say, look, the number of accidental car deaths is lower now than it was before we passed the laws. The thing is, if they're falling over time, you could pick any year, and the average number of accidental deaths are going to be less afterwards than they were before. And it's pretty much the drop rate has been the same even with cars before and after they passed these rules. But I don't think, because the number of hunters absolute number of hunters hasn't fallen, but we've seen an absolute drop in the number of accidental deaths, I don't think you're going to see a big effect there. Yeah.
A lot of times when you discuss people with the gun debate, it comes down to the argument as well, if we can do something to save one life, wasn't it worth it? And it just kind of seems like, how do we defeat that argument? Because that's like, well, as long as we can save one, it's all worth it to everybody to lose their guns.
Well, I suppose the simplest response is saying, well, if I can find one person who died as a result of the gun control regulation, then we shouldn't have the law. So, you go and ban guns from certain places, or you make it more costly for people to get it, or you impose waiting periods. Somebody may have needed to get a gun quickly for self-defense, and now they're not able to go and do it. Or somebody would have been able to afford a gun, and now they can't because you impose all these fines that are there. And so, but obviously, as you're implying, it's kind of a silly argument to make on either side. And the question shouldn't be whether you save one, it should be what's the net effect. Look, guns make it easier for bad things to happen, but they also make it easier for people to protect themselves and prevent bad things from happening. And the question is, what's the net effect? Fortunately, there are lots of good people, there are relatively few bad people out there. And we've gone through these arguments enough time. But anyway, so, yes.
You sort of talked around this, but we're really fixated on guns. Guns are not the #1 tool that kill people. I mean, we're not talking about, fist control or, or knife control. We're talking about gun control. Is there something you think genetic or visceral or magical about guns specifically?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about murders, most murders are committed with guns. I mean, it's not. And look, you know, it may be a little hard sometimes to figure out why the media fixates on certain types of things. Look, if somebody dies from an accidental gunshot, he gets a huge amount of media coverage. I spent a good part of the Bias Against Gun books just looking at the media coverage of accidental gun deaths. You have children who die from accidental gun deaths during the sample period that I looked at. You'll find anything from like a minimum of 24 stories to like 800 stories around the country, news stories about the incident there. You know, there's no other type of accidental death involving children that's going to get even a fraction of those types of stories. Now, you could, you know, I think people think they're a lot more common than they are as a result of that. If I go around and ask people in talks, how many accidental gun deaths do you think there are for children in the United States, you get numbers in the thousands often. You can go to the Centers for Disease Control website for 2010, which I think is still the last year the data is available for. You'll find that there were 32 accidental gun deaths for kids under age 10, and there was 52 accidental gun deaths for kids under age 15 in the United States. And, you know, it'd be better if it was zero. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, there's so many other items. For kids under age 5, you'll have about 36 who die from 5-gallon plastic water buckets in the United States. For kids under age 5, you'll have about 93 who die from drowning in bathtubs in the home. I can find rare types of death. You know, so you might say, well, maybe it's because it's so rare that it gets the news coverage. But, you know, you have kids that are crushed in threshers on farms. You know, you're talking about 5, 6, 7 a year there. It's a pretty gruesome way to die. And yet, and it's rare, but you're not going to find anything beyond maybe very localized media coverage about something like that. And, you know, you can look at decapitation of kids or other types of things, other rare deaths that are there, and you're not going to see the same type of national news coverage there. So there's something about guns per se. Look, I think a lot of the media coverage, you can, you know, in terms of the imbalance about the costs and benefits of guns, you know, when you can explain it. So like, without even trying, you probably can recall what seems like thousands of bad events that happen with guns that you've heard on the national news. You probably can only think of only a couple or a few national news stories, at least if you watch Fox, you can probably think of a few, where somebody used a gun to go and protect themselves, protect somebody else. You know, most people probably wouldn't realize, if you look at surveys, the Justice has a survey which looks at gun crimes, and it's about 450,000 a year crimes, which you've reported gun crimes like 250,000. Not all gun crimes are reported. But if you look at similar types of surveys that are done, you'll find that about 2 million times a year people use guns defensively to stop crimes. Most people would be surprised then that 4 or 5 times more frequently people use guns to stop crimes than use to commit them. And yet, if you rely on media coverage, you'd think it was the reverse, even more lopsided. Here's the problem, and that is, I can explain at least part of it, because, you know, the vast majority, 95% or whatever, of defensive gun uses merely involve brandishing a gun. You know, fewer than 1 out of every 1,000 times people use guns defensively is the attacker killed. And so, if you're an editor of a news bureau and you have a dead body on the ground, a person like a victim, and let's say you have a woman who brandished a gun, would-be attacker ran away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground, you're not even sure what crime would have been committed. I think any one of us would pick the first story as being more newsworthy than the second. Now, we may care about both stories from a policy perspective, but from a newsworthiness perspective, I think we can explain. Now, it doesn't explain everything. I mean, this is pretty much why I wrote the book, The Bias Against Guns. But, you know, so I'll give you one simple example. I may give you two, but one is, you look at these multiple victim public shootings. when a gun is used by civilian to go and stop these attacks, it will only get about 1% of the news stories will mention it. If a police officer uses a gun to stop one of these multiple victim public shootings, about 36% of the news stories will mention how it ended in that case. When I was writing the Bias Against Guns, there was one incident that occurred at the Appalachian Law School in Virginia in which 2 students there, both of them former deputy sheriffs, had run to their cars, gotten their guns. They'd been sheriffs in another state, had permits in Virginia, got their handguns, came back and stopped the attacker, ordered him to the ground, a third student tackled them, the 3 of them held him until police arrived. I did a radio interview with Larry Elder, who had a national radio show at the time. And Larry had on one of the 2 students that had stopped the attack, a guy named Tracy Bridges. And Bridges said he had been talked to like 50 different news media outlets the day of the attack. And being a law school student, he had Westlaw and Nexus and looked up the news stories because he wanted to see the quotes that they had from him. And he couldn't find anything, and even though he had talked to all these reporters. And I thought, that sounds extreme, probably exaggerate a little bit. So what I did was, I started calling up reporters who wrote stories about the incident. And they all, I called it like 50 of them, they all had either talked to either one or both of the students, except for a couple of them, but they all knew about the students, stopping the attack. And so I wasn't trying to argue with them. One, I wanted to find out if they knew about it. 2, if they talked to the students. And 3, why, if they knew all that, they didn't report it. And the types of explanations that we get from like Maria Glide at the Washington Post was that she only had like 935 words to write the story. And she simply didn't have space to get into that part of the story then. And so, I guess my response was, in my mind, I said, if it's kind of man bites dog is more of a news story than dog bites man. People, I'm reading through a story. I would think most people would think it would be more newsworthy to say the students got their guns from the car and used them to stop the attack. That would cause people to talk among themselves, saying, geez, look at what happened in this case. Instead, the news reports would say things like the students subdued the attacker, or the students tackled the attacker, or jumped on him, or things like that, almost implying as if these students ran across an open area against somebody who had a gun and attacked them. I probably wouldn't advise people to do it. And, but, they wouldn't even have space. They could have a couple paragraphs on the gun that was used, but they couldn't have even a few words there to change jump or subdued into adding a few more words saying they used got their guns from their cars to stop the attack. One other thing from the Bias Against Guns. When I was writing that book, I came across 10 stories where young kids, 8, 9, 10 years of age, had used guns to save the life of a relative. And some of these were fairly heroic stories. And one thing I realized, and this last part I only realized I should have done something about this while I was writing the book, I realized this afterwards, is that these reporters had also written were usually like crime reporters. And you'd see, they'd write up these heroic stories and they'd get like they wouldn't get picked up by the AP at all. But they'd write a story about a cab driver being shot, and that would be picked up by 24 newspapers. So I decided to call up the reporters and just say, why is it you write this story of this heroic young kid saving the life of his grandmother or something like that, and you have 250 words in the back of the newspaper on it, and yet you have this other story about a cab driver being shot. In many years, cab drivers are the most dangerous occupation in the United States because of crime committed against them. So it's not a man bites dog story. It's a dog bites man story, and yet that's the story that gets picked up in the AP and covered all these places. So there's one reporter I remember talking to from South Bend, Indiana newspaper. It was a situation where the boy's father had died from cancer. His mom was a drug addict. The boy's father, the boy's grandmother, paternal grandmother, was taking care of him because the mom was out of the picture. But the mom had dated this drug gang leader, and had told the drug gang leader that the grandmother kept a lot of money and jewelry at the home. And so the drug gang leader had come by, stabbed the grandmother in the stomach, had a knife to her throat, was threatening to kill her if she didn't tell him where the money and jewelry was in the house. She told the police that she was convinced if she told him, then he was going to kill her and the grandson. So anyway, while this was going on, the boy went up, got the grandmother's gun. The father, before he had died from cancer, had taken the boy shooting and showed him how to fire a gun. Boy came down, fatally shot the drug gang leader in the chest. And the grandmother told the police that she was convinced that if he hadn't done that, they both would have been killed. That got 250 words. I only found out more parts of the story when I talked to the reporter afterwards. And so I asked her, I said, well, you know, here you have this other story a couple months earlier that gets picked up in all these newspapers of this cab driver getting shot. Why do you have the cab driver being shot on your front page, have a long article on it, but this kid saving his grandmother's life, you have 250 words in the back of the newspaper? And her response was pretty similar to the response I got from other reporters that I talked to about it. And that was, she said, well, you know, they're very concerned about accidental gun deaths involving kids. And the concern was that if they write a positive story about kids and guns, that will allow parents to have their kids get more access to guns. And then they would feel responsible for any more of the accidental gun deaths that are there. I wasn't calling to argue with her about the number of accidental deaths. I didn't go and tell her the numbers I've told you about, but because that wasn't the point of me talking to her. But you know, the thing is, this kind of snowballs because people don't hear about these benefits. They hear about the huge, extensive national coverage about when something bad happens, and so you know, I think they're even more reluctant in the future then to go and run a story about, positive story about kids and guns at some point. Anyway, I'm getting hand signals here. So anyway, I appreciate you inviting me here. We've got some more books if anybody wants to get them, but I appreciate it.